It begins, as some stories do, with a storm. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind that tears roofs from houses or throws boats against the rocks. No, this was a slow-moving, soaking rain that blanketed the coast of northern Maine for 3 days in late October of 1952. The kind of rain that hums on the roof and quiets the town like a hand on the shoulder. Calming, heavy, relentless. In the small harbor town of Grayswick, population 411, the storm meant delays, postponed fishing runs, slippery sidewalks, and in the case of 63-year-old Edgar Grange, the postmaster of Grayswick for nearly 4 decades, it meant a rare late arrival to the post office. That Monday morning, Edgar's absence was unusual enough to prompt chatter, but not concern. People assumed he simply stayed in with the rain. Perhaps the bridge from his cottage had flooded again. Or perhaps he'd taken the morning to catch up on letters. He was, after all, the kind of man who still corresponded with cousins in New Hampshire and sent thank you notes to children who mailed him cookies at Christmas. By noon, a substitute clerk unlocked the post office and began sorting what little mail had arrived. It was a quiet day, and no one thought to call Edgar until dusk. But by the following morning, the concern had hardened into something else. A deputy was dispatched to check on him. Edgar's cottage, a 2-room shingled structure overlooking Fogdown Bay, sat on a slight rise surrounded by pine. When the deputy arrived, the screen door hung open, squeaking on its rusted hinge. The house was silent. Inside, a kettle sat cold on the stove. A coat was missing from the peg, but his boots remained under the bench by the door. On the table, a pile of undelivered letters, already sorted and bundled, ready for the week. Nearby sat his spectacles, folded neatly, and a receipt for 3 gallons of lamp oil. But Edgar Grange was nowhere to be found. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, no note, just the silence of a room left behind in the middle of routine. Locals organized the search that evening. Dozens of neighbors, lanterns swinging, walked the muddy paths behind Edgar's house, calling his name. They combed the slope down to the bay and walked the half-mile trail to the rocky lookout where Edgar was known to sit and watch the fishing boats come in. But the storm had left no tracks, only softened the earth and wiped it clean. For a week they searched, but Edgar had vanished. What puzzled authorities most was the lack of any practical reason for his disappearance. He had no known enemies, no outstanding debts, and no family drama to speak of. His health, though not perfect, was stable. He had once mentioned a heart murmur to a pharmacist in town, but otherwise remained independent and capable. Some suggested he may have slipped, fallen into the sea, and been swept away by the tide. But there were no drag marks near the edge, no signs of disorientation or panic. And something about the way his glasses were folded on the table didn't sit right with folks. As if he had taken them off mid-thought, or for just a moment, intending to return. Then came the mail log. Every Friday, Edgar was known to fill out a short summary of outgoing and incoming mail. A habit he'd continued even though no one had required it in years. Tucked behind the post office's back counter, the log showed neat weekly notes, until the week of the storm. That entry was different. Instead of listing the volume of letters or the parcel count, Edgar had written one line. "Something is wrong at the bay." Nothing more.
That line, which came to light during the third week of the investigation, shifted the tone of the town. Theories began to form. Had he seen something? Witnessed someone coming or going where they shouldn't be? Was there a boat, perhaps, that docked quietly under the cover of rain?
And if so, what might Edgar have done about it? The deputy revisited the path to the lookout. Locals say he stood there a long time, even after dark, listening. In time, the search efforts slowed. The holidays came and went, and the town gradually folded the mystery into its rhythm. A new postmaster was appointed. The cottage remained vacant for years. But something about the case lingered. Occasionally, in winter, a letter still arrived addressed to Edgar Grange. Most were returned to sender, but once, a plain envelope arrived with no return address. It contained only a single item, a postcard, blank, except for the back, which read, "October light is softest just before the storm." No one recognized the handwriting. No one ever came forward. And to this day, the question remains, what did Edgar see at the bay?
The wind has calmed in Gracewick, but the questions haven't. The postcard, with its vague, poetic message, became the most curious piece of evidence in Edgar Grange's disappearance, if it could even be called evidence. By itself, it proved nothing. But the timing, arriving 5 weeks after Edgar was last seen, made it impossible to ignore. The sheriff, still new to the role and eager to prove himself, had the postcard analyzed. The ink was ordinary, the cardstock standard. No fingerprints, no postal markings beyond the Gracewick stamp. No clue where it had come from or how it had arrived at the post office without a return address. It had simply appeared in the first mail batch of the new year. The sheriff asked around. None of the postal clerks recalled sorting it. No one had seen it delivered. The local paper, the Gracewick Gazette, published a quiet article on it, titled, "Postcard May Be Clue in Grange's Disappearance." But interest was already fading. Edgar was gone, and winter was long. Still, the sheriff continued his inquiries, and soon he found something peculiar in the old mailroom records.
During the week of the storm, when Edgar had vanished, there had been an unusual mail route signature. On Thursday, October 30th, a small steamer mailbag was logged as having arrived from an inlet town farther north, Haleford Cove. Nothing strange about that, except for one detail. Haleford Cove hadn't operated postal services since 1948. The town had been decommissioned, residents relocated, buildings abandoned to the sea. The sheriff checked with regional dispatch. No one could explain the routing. Might have been a mistake, they said, an old label or a repurposed bag. But the bag itself, one of the canvas mail sacks used for long-distance deliveries, was never found. Edgar's sorting notes simply listed Haleford Cove Satchel, 7 parcels, no errors. None of those parcels had return addresses, and all were listed as held for pickup. Why would Edgar hold them, and who was meant to pick them up? Across town, older residents began to recall Haleford Cove with a kind of distant unease. It was a strange place even before it shut down. Small, claustrophobic, one of those half-forgotten fishing outposts that seemed always wet and always quiet. A few families had settled there in the 1910s. Rumors said they kept to themselves, practiced old maritime traditions, and didn't come to town unless they had to. By the 1940s, several of the homes had been condemned due to erosion and rising tides. There were stories of unstable cliffs, but also strange hearsay of visitors not being welcomed and things being left behind in the tide pools. Nothing official, but just enough to earn the town a reputation. The sheriff, sent a request to the regional archive. A week later, he received a small envelope of documents, mostly census records and faded inspection reports. But tucked at the bottom was a hand-typed letter from 1949, written by a postal inspector named Clarence Miles. It read, quote, Halliford Cove's box inventory is in disarray. No forwarding addresses. Several parcels unclaimed. One residence, 21 Cove Road, has refused mail for 3 consecutive months. Recommend discontinuation of service and reassignment of carrier route. End quote. 21 Cove Road. That address came up again a few days later when the sheriff, still trying to make sense of Edgar's last days, visited the attic storage of the Gracewick post office. Among dusty bundles of old mail, he found something he wasn't expecting. A parcel, wrapped in oiled paper, bound in twine. The tag read, To 21 Cove Road, Halliford Cove. From E. Grange, Gracewick. The parcel was never logged, never processed. It looked older than a few months, perhaps much older. Inside, the sheriff found what appeared to be a personal notebook, leather-bound, weather-stained, and fragile. On the first page, written in Edgar's careful script, quote, To whom it may concern, if I have failed to return, it is because I followed what I should not have followed. End quote. He turned the page. What followed was a kind of diary, dated, but with no year, just October 23 through October 30. The final entry read, A boat came last night, small, no lights. I saw it from the bluff, just beyond the pines, tied up at the old east dock. No one else noticed. I stayed until the lamp ran out. In the morning, there was a box on the shore. No footprints, just the box. Inside, I found the ledger, unmarked, but I think I know what it is. I'll deliver it. I've waited long enough. End quote. There were no further entries. This, now, was no longer just a disappearance. Edgar hadn't simply vanished into the fog. He had left behind a breadcrumb trail, a personal one. But a trail toward what? The sheriff, growing quietly obsessed, made a decision that raised more than a few eyebrows in town. He would travel to Halliford Cove. Despite the town's official status as vacant and unsafe, the shoreline could still be accessed by boat during calm tides. With the help of a local fisherman, he planned the visit for the following week when the waters were expected to be still. You really think he went there? The fisherman asked quietly. I think he saw something, and I think he went looking for where it came from. They departed at dawn. It was a cold morning, the sea flat and metallic, the kind of calm that makes your thoughts louder. The journey took 2 hours. As the boat rounded the inlet, the ruins of Halliford Cove came into view. Low stone chimneys, splintered docks, and the remains of a church bell lying on its side like a toppled statue. Salt had bleached everything gray. And then, just visible near the old east dock, a narrow path rose through the brush. As they approached, the sheriff noticed something wedged in the rocks near shore, a scrap of canvas, faded, water-stained. He reached down. It was part of a mailbag, stamped faintly across it, Gracewick P.O. He looked up, toward the empty homes. Something is wrong at the bay. The same phrase Edgar had written in his final mail log. But what did he mean? And what had he found in Halliford Cove that night?
You're still with the story, still following Edgar's quiet footprints through fog and salt.
As the sheriff climbed a slippery path toward the heart of Halford Cove, he noted how unnaturally still everything felt. No birds, no creaking boards, just wind through ruined rooftops and the soft, steady hiss of the tide. Most of the homes were hollow, window frames without glass, front doors hanging open, roofs caved inward. But as he neared the old road, one house stood more intact than the others. 21 Cove Road. He recognized it from the inspector's notes. The only residence in town that had reportedly refused mail in the year before the Cove's postal service was discontinued. The porch sagged, the door creaked softly but didn't fall. He stepped inside. What he found was strange. Not abandoned exactly. Dusty, yes, weathered by time, but not entirely empty. There were signs someone had been there more recently than expected. A chair near the fireplace, pulled out slightly. A rusted lantern on a shelf. On the mantel, a small framed photo face down, its glass cracked. He lifted it carefully. The photograph was old, maybe 1920s or earlier. A young man in uniform stood beside a woman holding a folded letter. They looked unsmiling, but not unhappy. He turned the frame over. On the back, written in the same neat handwriting as a postcard that had arrived at the Grayswick post office, "October light is softest just before the storm." He stood very still. The house creaked slightly behind him, as if exhaling. In the corner of the room, he noticed a canvas satchel, half buried beneath a rotted trunk. Inside were several parcels, unopened, each addressed to various names, none familiar, but all marked as intended for delivery to Helliford Cove, all dated from the 1930s through the 1950s, all long after the supposed end of mail service there. Who had kept sending mail to a town that no longer accepted it? And who had been receiving it? One of the parcels had already been opened. Inside was a ledger, not the kind used for bookkeeping, but for tracking names and dates. And next to each date, a small symbol, a triangle, a cross, a blank space. There were more than 60 names in the ledger, but one stood out to the sheriff. Grange, E. No date beside it, just a blank space. He looked again at the photo, then at the satchel, then out the window toward the cove. It was growing dark. Reluctantly, the sheriff returned to the boat, sat silent the entire trip home, and logged the discovery in his private notes. He never filed a formal report. In town, he simply stated, "Cove was empty, found nothing of note." But a few days later, he quietly paid a visit to Edgar Grange's abandoned cottage. In the cupboard beneath the sink, he found a narrow box tied with blue twine. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Haleford Cove, most sealed, a few open. One letter written in Edgar's hand read, "I don't know why they keep coming. I don't know who still lives there, or if anyone does, but the letters don't stop. I've tried to return them. They always find their way back." Another note, unfinished, simply read, "There is something about the bay, something the sea won't give up." Years passed. The case remained unsolved. Grayswick moved on, slowly, the way small towns do. The cottage was eventually sold, the post office repainted. But even now, once or twice a year, a letter still arrives. No return address. Always the same destination. 21 Cove Road, Haleford Cove. The new postmaster, a younger woman, practical, no nonsense, keeps them in a drawer, unsent, unopened. She doesn't like the way the ink smudges when you touch the paper, or the way the envelopes feel slightly damp, no matter the season. And though she's never said so aloud, she's kept a simple rule ever since she took the job. She never works alone when there's a storm, because somewhere along the coast, between the sea and the fog, there's a place that still receives mail, and no one knows who's reading it.
Every case leaves behind more questions than answers. If you're the kind who needs to know more, go ahead and subscribe. We dig deeper every time.